All right, everyone. Hello. I'm Nancy Vitale. Welcome to the 20th Annual Brattleboro Literary Festival. I'm the producer. I'm, again, Nancy Vitale, producer of literary programs at PEN America and the PEN World Voices Festival. And I'm honored today to present to you Carol Diehl, author of Banksy Completed. You can see the chat for links to purchase the book from our partners at Antidote Books. Also, don't forget, if you have questions for Carol, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, and we will be getting to them after her presentation. And if somebody has asked a question that you're very interested in, just click the little thumbs up icon to upvote the question so I can keep an eye on those. Speaking of thumbs up, big special thanks to our sponsors for their support of the festival and for this wonderful event you're about to enjoy. So let's get right to it. Carol Diehl is an artist and art critic, a longtime contributing editor to Art in America, as well as a former slam poet at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. Rock on, Carol. She's won fellowships from the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Pollock Krasner Foundation, PEN America, and for her blog Art Vent, a Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant. And Carol has taught both painting and writing at Bennington College and the Graduate Fine Arts Program for the School of Visual Arts. Also, because if that's not enough, for the last 25 years, she served as an art consultant for Time magazine, commissioning fine artists from Christo to Jean-Claude to Shepard Fairey for the covers. And this is her first book. And with that, let's hear from this remarkable person herself about Banksy Completed. Take it away, Carol.
Thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here and to bring Banksy to a literary audience where I think he belongs. This book was a surprise for me. Banksy was the last artist I ever thought I'd write a book about. In fact, I didn't even think I'd write a book, but in the beginning, although fascinated by his anonymity, I had the same dismissive attitude toward him my other art critic colleagues did. An only moderately talented graffitist, just out to make money. However, I also spent a lot of time in England, where Banksy is considered a national treasure, and began to think the art critics might be missing something. In addition, I've always loved graffiti. Of course, like all art, there's good graffiti and bad graffiti, but I was lucky enough to be in New York in the 1980s when graffiti was at its height, drawing tourists from Europe to see the spray paintings on the sides of subway cars. At the time, I was showing my work at the Sydney Janis Gallery, where Sydney, an octogenarian who had always been interested in self-taught artists, was the first blue-chip gallerist to show the graffiti artists, whom I got to know, especially Crash and Days and Lady Pink. I loved the color, the surprise element, and that artists existed who would actually risk their lives to make their art. And then I would go down to my subway station in the morning and see a surprise Keith Haring. They were as if they were magical. They were as if they dropped from just another realm. Ultimately, unconsciously, elements of graffiti began to creep into my own work. Use of stencils, spray ink, and layers of image on image. Then Banksy crossed the pond in 2013 for what he dubbed his New York residency, executing a piece somewhere in the 5 boroughs every day for a month. And I watched my writer colleagues, eager for the clickbait, take every opportunity to dismiss him without doing their usual critical research. Figuring there was nothing there, they found nothing. So really, my book was born of annoyance. Surely, I thought, if Jeff Koons had made an Academy Award-nominated film, critics would have taken the time to see it. Without really knowing what was driving me, except for the suspicion that there was more there than anyone thought, I undertook that research, which for me consists of acute observation of what's in front of me and then connecting the dots. What I discovered was surprising depth and substance, an artist deserving of a significant place in the art historical canon. And after that, I couldn't stop. What started out as a lecture, this lecture, turned into a book. When the British wish to acknowledge a burp or fart, either to excuse themselves or embarrass you, they say, better out than in. For Banksy, it has a double meaning, referring also to Cézanne, who said, all pictures painted inside in the studio will never be as good as those done outside. So he chose it as a title for his 2013 New York residency, generating at least one work per day for the month of October, as well as a storm of controversy. Not since Christo and Jean-Claude's The Gates in 2005 had the New York public been so engaged with art. And when the public likes something too much, art critics get nervous. This dim view of popular intelligence was expressed by New York Magazine's art critic Jerry Saltz, who wrote, people like Banksy because other people have liked Banksy, and liking Banksy becomes a way of feeling like you're part of something, participating in the group mind. So while Banksy devoted October to producing artwork on the streets of New York and on his website, Saltz, in an unprecedented number of articles, television, and radio appearances on a single subject, devoted the month to dissing the bad artist he dubbed Mr. Meh. If the more than 500 responses to each of Saltz's Facebook posts about Banksy can be seen as indicators, the rest of the art world was in fervent agreement, closing rank against the upstart outsider with whom most, surprisingly, seemed to be unfamiliar. Also weighing in on Banksy's lack of artistic prowess was New York Times critic Roberta Smith, who is married to Saltz and who asked, but what if these works is art? His October offerings have a made-by-committee variety, full of ad man jokes and sight gags that emphasize a clear punchline over visual style. The only outlier seemed to be New York Times writer Deborah Solomon, who, in a radio interview, compared Banksy to 17th century political satirist William Hogarth. Anyway, this flap caused Saltz and me, old friends that we are, to go head to head on Facebook, each insisting the other had lost their critical marbles. He faulted me for having a weak eye, while I held out the hope that if Saltz were to assess the breadth of Banksy's output, look at the videos and audio guides posted daily during the month on Banksy's website, peruse his books, and watch his film, Exit Through the Gift Shop, he might have a greater understanding, if not appreciation, of his work. At least Saltz wouldn't have described Banksy as the subject of a big-time documentary, when those who have seen Exit know it is yet another Banksy prank, that his role in the mind bender he produced is supporting at most, and the question of whether it's a documentary or a mockumentary remains frustratingly unanswered. On Facebook, in the beginning of November, Saltz allowed he still hadn't seen the film, but that everyone says it's great. Meanwhile, Banksy's opinion of art critics equals their opinions of him. When one called him a complete clown, the artist said, when criticizing art in return for money, please try to remember who the parasite is in this relationship. So now I'm going to risk my hard-earned art world credibility, and hopefully not my friendships with Saltz and Smith, whose works I otherwise admire, to go on record to say that Banksy is one of the geniuses of our time, a worthy bearer of the torch passed by Marcel Duchamp. Among other things, Banksy challenges the culture to reconsider what art is, as well as its value and purpose. If this weren't the case, there wouldn't be so many people so upset about a guy who visits the city for a month and paints on the sides of buildings. By focusing on the images alone and comparing hasty spray paintings on exterior walls to gallery and museum art, Saltz and Smith overlook not only the history and intention of street art, but the essence of Banksy, each of whose endeavors are more like an intervention, action, or happening, which John Cage said should be like a net to catch a fish, the nature of which one does not know. The videos and audio guides, the context, reactions, what happens to it after, painted over, not painted over, removed and sold by others for profit, stolen, destroyed, all comprise a synthesis of contextual and conceptual art, social commentary, political protest, and relational aesthetics played out not in museums at $20 to $25 a head, but where it can have the most effect, in the street, in the real world. Saltz writes, another day, another Banksy. The image this time, an idiotic dog shadow peeing on a fire hydrant thing. There's a thought balloon drifting from the hydrant that says, you complete me. Really? That's what people think is so great and important and so politically pointed? Really? Key here is the cryptic phrase, you complete me, from the 1996 film Jerry Maguire that became a meme before there were memes. So by acting the art critic and figuratively pissing on the piece, Saltz unwittingly completes it, as Banksy clearly anticipated in his audio guide for that day, where you hear a narrator say,
you are in Midtown Manhattan. Are you looking at one of the great artworks of the 21st century? If so, you're in the wrong place. You should be looking at a stencil of a dog peeing on a hydrant. Spay art. It's one of mine. It's a well-known truism that the mark of a great artist is their ability to capture light. So you will note that this piece is rendered entirely in silhouette. To the average viewer, this may seem at first glance a thin, faux, comical cartoon aimed at providing a small glimmer of light relief to local commuters. But look again, and what do you see? That's right, a structural recontextualizing of the juxtaposition between form and surface. Welcome to the art world. Perhaps Banksy is playing with the notion that graffiti is the territorial sprayings of feral youth. After all, wouldn't the architecture foisted on our cities be incomplete without the maverick stains of those answering back? Or perhaps, as some would argue, this is a broader comment on the nature of abusive relationships. But those people need to shut up. They need to have some sense because
soon Banksy had provoked a number of others into appearing stuffy and silly, while simultaneously operating as his unpaid publicity agents, like Mayor Bloomberg, who presents himself as a supporter of the arts, but said he was mobilizing the police to get Banksy. There's a fable that appears in Banksy's book, Wall in Peace, where the king's court painter is pitted in competition with a dirty and disheveled stranger who claims he is the greatest painter in the land. After 30 days of working feverishly day and night, the artists presented their paintings, both hidden by a cloth, to the king. The court painters, presented first, was so realistic a bird flew down and tried to snatch a painted grape. When the vagabond refused to pull the covering from his painting, the king tried in vain to pull it away himself. You see, said the tramp quietly, there is no blanket covering the painting. This is actually just a painting of a cloth covering a painting. And whereas your famous artist is content to fool nature, I've made the king of the country look like a bit of a twat. Banksy attributes the story to a man in a pub, when actually it's his adaptation of a Greek legend about two 5th century BC painters who stage a contest to prove who is the better artist. The French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, whose writing greatly influenced critical theory, uses the legend as an example when discussing trompe-l'oeil, saying that if one wishes to deceive the man, what one presents to him is the painting of the veil. That is to say, something that incites him to ask what is behind it. Trompe-l'oeil, of course, is one of Banksy's primary tools. Often it's literal in the form of signs or markings that mimic official ones, such as a stenciled sign for a designated graffiti area that carries an authentic looking crest that he lifted from a cigarette package. But it's also active in the way Banksy incorporates the existing elements and blends his images so thoroughly into their surroundings that they look as if they'd always been there. These are images that don't shout for attention, but slide obliquely into your consciousness. So you have to pull yourself back and question them while questioning yourself. Did I really see that? Does that wall under that surveillance camera really say One Nation under CCTV? And if they're watching, how did it get there? Scholar and cultural critic Lewis Hyde, in his book, Trickster Makes This World, describes the archetype that appears throughout world mythology. Adept at creating and unmasking deceit, proficient at hiding his tracks and seeing through the devices used by others to hide theirs, Trickster is a boundary crosser, a traveler and thief who is amoral, not immoral. He embodies and enacts that large portion of our experience where good and evil are hopelessly intertwined. When he lies and steals, it isn't so much to get away with something or to get rich as to disturb the established categories of truth and property. And by doing so, open the road to possible new worlds. Hyde would argue tricksters are necessary for the reason that no self-contained world can induce its own fundamental change, because self-containment means it knows nothing beyond its own givens. In other words, our view of the world, our assumptions are what we have to work with, and change must come from the outside. In Greek mythology, the trickster is Hermes, whom Banksy evoked when configuring the fiberglass replica of Ronald McDonald that appeared on the sidewalk outside a different McDonald's every lunchtime for a week in mid-October, accompanied by a real boy who sat shining his shoes. Let me let the train go by before I start this. It's really far away, but it sounds like it's going right through my studio. I don't know if you can hear it. Okay, I think it's gone. Well, there's the face.
What you see before you is a sculpture entitled Shoe Shine, dating from the summer of 2013, depicting the powerful figure of Ronald McDonald waiting impassively as his ridiculously oversized clown shoes are buffed to a fine shine. Ronald was adopted as the official mascot of the McDonald's fast food corporation chain in 1966. Fiberglass versions of his likeness have been installed outside restaurants ever since, thus making Ronald arguably the most sculpted figure in history after Christ. For this piece, the artist has reproduced Ronald McDonald in perfect detail, single-handedly. By perfect detail, you mean roughly, and by single-handedly, you mean with two people helping. The result is a critique of the heavy labor required to sustain the polished image of a mega corporation. Is Ronald's statuesque pose indicative of how corporations have become the historical figures of our era? Does this hero have feet of clay and a massively large footprint to boot? But take a closer look, and you may notice something familiar about this clown. His face is that of the Greek god Hermes, carved by Praxiteles in 340 BC. Is this a wry, oblique reference to Greek mythology? Or did the artist have such difficulty trying to sculpt the face, he simply plonked on the nearest replica bust he could find? We will never know. It's the second one.
Even if you don't recognize that Banksy's Ronald McDonald is modeled after Greek sculpture, his face and bearing read subliminally as representative of the patriarchy. His attitude is disdainful, and given his stance, Ronald's foot might well be on the back of the boy. Of course, as Banksy no doubt expected, the piece was regularly ticketed for obstructing pedestrian traffic thereby forcing the police inadvertently into the position of being protectors of the McDonald brand. One weird after effect of Banksy's version of Ronald McDonald is that once you've seen it, the original statue appears downright pervy. It's also amusing to consider that Hermes is the name of a luxury brand, as well as the god associated with cattle. Hermes is also the god of overland travel, represented by mounds of rough stones called cairns, used from prehistory to the present to mark trails and landmarks. These cairns are remarkably like Banksy's replica of the Great Sphinx of Giza, made from smashed cinder blocks that appeared on October 22nd in an abandoned lot in Queens. Leaving no turn unstoned, he titled it Everything But the Kitchen Sphinx, and advised visitors not to drink the replica Arab spring water. Capitalism, imperialism, greed, and war are Banksy's primary targets. In his book, Wall and Peace, he writes, "We can't do anything to change the world until capitalism crumbles. In the meantime, we should all go shopping to console ourselves." These themes converged when Banksy repurposed an original artwork, an overwrought pastoral oil painting purchased for $50 from the Housing Works thrift store. Housing Works is a Brooklyn-based nonprofit that benefits homeless people with AIDS. With his painted edition of a solitary Nazi figure seated in contemplation on a bench, the painting of an autumn forest by a river with snowy mountains in the distance is transformed from kitsch Americana to Caspar David Friedrich-esque German Romanticism, the falling yellow leaves now signifying the decline of the Nazi regime. Scrawling his signature under that of the original artist, Banksy, on his website, entitled the work, The Banality of Evil, Oil on Canvas, 2013, and described it as a thrift store painting vandalized and re-donated to the thrift store, with the intention that the proceeds go to Housing Works, which auctioned it off and ultimately, after much bidding drama, netted at least $450,000. On the Village Voice blog, writer Raylan Brooks no doubt Googled the banality of evil to discover that it was associated with Holocaust survivor and philosopher Hannah Arendt's theoretical reckoning of the Nazis' rise to power, but concluded that more likely it had something to do with Banksy not really caring much about what he's actually saying, when it's clearly the key to Banksy's philosophy and the theme that underlies his subversive enterprises. A report on the banality of evil is the subtitle of Arendt's 1963 book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, an eyewitness account of the Nazi criminal trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was accused of participating in engineering the extermination of European Jews. Arendt expressed shock that Eichmann did not come across as a monster, but instead terribly and terrifyingly normal. A man whose thinking was so conventional that he spoke only in cliches. This led Arendt to develop her thesis that beyond Hitler's vile nature, it was the mediocrity of his functionaries, their unwillingness to think for themselves while attempting to fulfill their mundane needs and individual ambitions, hence their banality, that enabled the Nazi atrocities. Therefore, Banksy's title has to do with the original painting being itself a cliche, the work of a painter who is trying to please others rather than thinking for himself. And by inserting the Nazi officer, Banksy is adding a symbol of banality to banality with his oil on oil. While being tried, Eichmann insisted on his innocence. He never killed anyone or ordered that anyone be killed, nor did he have a grudge against Jews. He was a man eager to get ahead, and his job, which he fulfilled efficiently, was to arrange for the transportation of Jewish prisoners to death camps. To do otherwise, he explained on the stand, would be to break the law at the time, and he was not a lawbreaker. The prisoner's destination was not his responsibility. This concept is at the heart of Bernhard Schlink's 1995 novel, The Reader, later made into a film. One of two main characters, Hannah, is being tried for war crime, but she's not an officer, nothing like it, simply a guard who never considers the possibility that she could defy orders and unlock the burning church in which most of her prisoners die. Like Eichmann, what's chilling about Hannah is her ordinariness. She's just doing her job. Arendt suggests that evil is more accidental than intentional, less a result of ideology and conviction than a byproduct of petty ambition and the drive for personal security. Expanding on Arendt's thesis was Stanley Milgram's famous psychological experiment that measured the willingness of study participants to obey an authority figure who instructed them to inflict what they thought were electrical shocks on a hidden subject, an actor whose screams they could hear. Milgram concluded that ordinary people simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible destructive process. When asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority. Commenting on this experiment, Banksy has noted, garments are symbols of authority, and we have a powerful tendency to accept authority. Take the man out of the doctor's costume, and his test subjects refuse to do it. Ironically, while railing against this failing of humans to question their environment, Banksy uses it consciously to his own ends. Not one to skulk around in a hoodie as he appears in his film. One of his methods for avoiding detection is to look as official as possible. To turn invisible, he recommends a high-vis vest, hard hat, clipboard, and business cards, not to mention 3 stories of scaffolding under a CCTV camera. Banksy. The greatest crimes in the world are not committed by people breaking the rules, but by people following the rules. It's people who follow orders that drop bombs and massacre villages. As a precaution to ever committing major acts of evil, it is our solemn duty to never do what we're told. This is the only way we can be sure. In that context, Banksy's entire crusade can be seen as one against what Arendt called a failure to think, or in other words, mediocrity in all its forms. Because Banksy's work is also political and often incorporates cigarettes, silhouettes, sometimes cigarettes. Our friend Jerry Saltz compares him negatively to one of our best known American artists, winner of a MacArthur Genius Award, saying, Banksy's art is conventional political realism and doesn't pack anywhere near the formal or psychological incendiary wallop of, say, the artist Carol Walker, who's been making cutout paper silhouettes of slave life for almost 20 years. There's some examples. I've never been a fan of Walker, who is approximately the same age as Banksy, with the same career span, mainly because her work involves stereotypes engaged in Jim Crow stereotypes, really, engaged in violence and suggests no solution. To me, using violence to protest violence, sexism, degradation, and racism to protest sexism, degradation, and racism is exploitive and takes advantage of our basic nature, leaving us either titillated or enraged. Yes, those were horrific times, but what about now? While Banksy risks arrest or bullets, as when he bombed the West Bank barrier wall, Walker is not painting her images on barns in KKK land. Her audience is the billionaires who buy her work and those who can afford to see it in museums, thereby enabling them to make a show of being on the right side without having to do anything about it. This has been called cash for credibility, or agitprop to decorate your living room with, about an artist who is taking radical gestures and observing them into a narrative that supports capitalism. The effectiveness of institutionalized protest, or rather the lack of it, was brought home to me when I went to the Metropolitan Opera to see Philip Glass's Satyagraha about Gandhi and nonviolent resistance, after which guards were employed to steer the exiting audience clear of the actual Occupy protest taking place outside, which Glass participated in. What no doubt leads Saltz to include Banksy, as he has, of being anarchy light, is the very thing that makes his work sophisticated and radical. It vilifies no one, with some exceptions, such as when he placed a blow-up statue dressed and shackled like a Guantanamo prisoner in a Disneyland ride. Banksy doesn't condemn, but rather chides as he presents alternatives to the status quo. What if there wasn't another crap advert here? What if two Bobbies could kiss freely? What if children could play safely on Palestine's West Bank barrier? Living as we do in a culture that's constantly pitting one side against another, such an attitude can be confusing, especially when dealing with matters of life and death. This gentle, humanistic image from the West Bank barrier wall between Palestine and Israel says it all. And then there's the video Banksy posted on October 6th, where in just 1.5 minutes, he makes a convincing case that war is mindless cruelty.
الله اكبر كريم دفاع الجوي تمام محافظ حلب الطيران الحربي الله اكبر 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 ما قلنا الله ربا الدفاع الجوي تبع المجلس العسكري الثوري في محافظة حلب اسقاط الطائرة والروحية في محيط مطار بالنقل العسكري الله أكبر 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 الله أكبر
Along with the voices still baffled Raylan Brooks, who wrote, "It's unclear what this is supposed to mean," the pundits engaged in conjecture. From The Independent, commenters believe the clip reflects the way we've been granted an insight into the Syrian conflict through videos uploaded onto the internet. From the Business Insider, there's some speculation that the video is a reference to the Dumbo section of Brooklyn. Perhaps it will be the location of the artist's next piece. 9 News. The clip has been criticized online, with some commenters suggesting Banksy is indifferent to the plight of Syrians and has trivialized their struggle. Robert Mackay, on his New York Times blog, many close observers of the conflict in Syria were either confused or unimpressed by the artist's gnomic commentary. Meanwhile, it was a comment on Reddit that summed it up. It's a view of war from the eyes of the child. The adults feel victorious for ideological reasons. The child doesn't have these ideas and only sees that the adults killed something beautiful. So he goes over and kicks the guy as if to say, "Great work, you fucking doofus." Exactly. Why does the public get Banksy when the critics don't? Most likely because the public knows more about Banksy than the experts, who, perceiving a sudden opportunity for publicity, appear to be rushing to judgment without doing their homework. Further, the public has no vested interest to defend. Banksy's critics, however, unconsciously complete the work or expose themselves as twats by revealing how the lens of self-interest can limit observation. Embedded in their own narratives and hampered by their preconceptions, they seem to fear they will lose their authority if they succumb to the antics of the trickster. Another example is Carol Diehl, described in the Times article as a Lebanese-British architect and online satirist who tweeted about the video. None of that is related to art. He's a crude propagandist, and that's if you want to flatter him. Banksy's art makes you think. How dumb do you have to be to need something to remind you to think? Diehl may not need to be reminded to think, perhaps, but maybe to notice that an essential component of propaganda, ideology, is lacking here. If Banksy's work does invite us to think, it is to imagine a world without these cultural givens, to look at it with the innocence of children who appear so frequently in his work and who, as in the Dumbo video, just might have a clearer view than the adults whose decisions form their world. Banksy, when the time comes to leave, just walk away quietly and don't make any fuss. There were some on Facebook who expected that Banksy would mark his tenure in New York by going out with a bang on the last day, maybe painting a whole subway train. Instead, in the wee hours, on the side of an abandoned building on the Long Island Expressway, Banksy installed an inflated blow-up, spelling out his name in the bubble letters we've come to associate with graffiti. It lasted until midday, when 3 men scaled ladders to take the letters down. They were arrested for criminal mischief, as we yet don't have official terminology to apply to those caught vandalizing vandalism, and the police confiscated the work. In such cases, unclaimed property is held for up to 18 months, after which it's considered abandoned, and then either destroyed or auctioned off to benefit the city's general fund. So yes, the police could auction the piece off and engage $200,000 to $300,000, but only if they designate it as art, which would put them in the untenable position of condoning Banksy's illegal efforts. It was a quiet move on Banksy's part, but one that left the police with the job of defining what is and isn't art. Trickster to the end, when he left town, Banksy also removed his website so that the only record of his activities is in reflections of others who complete the experience, as I am doing now by reading this, and you by listening to it, and hopefully asking questions.
Well, thank you, Carol. That was amazing. What a deep dive into one of the most exciting and elusive artists of our time. Thank you so much. Do you want to keep the share up? Let's keep it up there so you all can see what her book looks like. And don't forget, you can pick it up for pre-order through Antidote Books. And the link should be in the chat for you. And if you have any questions, please add them to the chat. I see a couple in there, and I'm probably going to be a little selfish here and jump in with some of my own while we're waiting for you all. So I think the first thing I wanted to ask was, I'm going to go right to the elephant in the room, not a dead Dumbo, just straight up elephant here, and ask who you think Banksy is. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that. Totally joking. How would you, it's like the wrong question.
It's always asked.
I know, right? I'm curious how though, I'd much rather know how as a critic, you respond to people who seem to be obsessed with Banksy's identity.
Well, actually, people aren't obsessed with Banksy's identity. I think people are really satisfied to not know who he is. And
Okay, I
one
guess just
time,
me, because I'm curious.
yeah, one time when a television company called me and wanted me to participate in a series they were doing where they were going to reveal who he was. Well, this is a story about how he maintains his anonymity. I said, nobody wants to know who he is. You would make the least popular television series ever. And then I hung up the phone and I called Banksy's managing company. I called Brooklyn Street Art. I called everyone I knew involved with graffiti and warned them that these people would be calling. And then I realized that I was part of a worldwide network that maintains Banksy's anonymity. I would say a worldwide network and a whole bunch of non-disclosure agreements. But basically, really, no one wants to know. And for me, that's part of the art. It means that we can concentrate on the message and not the messenger. We are not concerned about whether he's going to get a divorce or, what hairstyle he has or what, what person he might have voted for. None of that comes into play. And that's what I think is really great about it. And it makes it indeed an intrinsic part of the art.
I love that. And I also really appreciate that you reference Lewis Hyde's trickster definition. I think it really fits here. Big fan of that book. And especially because of the sort of anti-capitalist threads that run through his work so very clearly. I'm curious, can you speak to how people commodify his work after the fact? I mean, when we were talking briefly before this event, I mentioned how one of his paintings in New York City was on the side of, at the time it was a shoe store, in a building that was owned by Zabar's.
Right.
And somebody put plexi over it and a big sign that said owned by Zabar's. This building is owned by Zabar's, and the owner got up there and smiled for the camera.
Right.
It was just the most absurd moment. It felt very anti-Banksy to me, but I loved your response to it.
Well, I actually, I like that piece and the way it was done because it generates actual responses to the art in the place that it was meant to be. And when I was there doing an interview one time, a man stopped us and said, his name was Andrew, he introduced himself, and he says he volunteers, nobody at Zabar's, nobody asked him, he volunteers to clean that plexi every week just to keep it clean. So there's still a story there. Whereas the opposite is the Banksy Exhibition, if I can actually glorify it by calling it an exhibition, we'll call it an exhibit, that's currently down on Broadway and 14th, I think, where people have taken his work without his permission. I mean, they've taken it from people who own it. They've borrowed his work. And it's prints, and they put it up, and they have an immersive Banksy thing that you can go into, like the Van Gogh immersive thing. They charge people $30 to $40 a head to go there. They have his name spread all up and down the street, and Banksy makes no money for it. It's really a highly illegal thing. And there have been, at least there are several now, one in New York, one in LA, and there have been at least 40 throughout the world. Somebody sent me a picture of one in Florence currently. And, they're just completely cashing in on Banksy, like the people who sell things at auction, because he doesn't make any of that money either. But he says he's doing illegal work. Graffiti is illegal. So therefore, it would be hypocritical of him to criticize people who are taking advantage of him, who are doing things that are illegal. He still doesn't like it. He calls it non-consensual.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to Stuart Chase asked the question, comments on a recently sold shredded work for over 20 million, right? That sort of secondary art market from which he doesn't benefit.
Right. Yeah, he benefits not at all. And I think a lot of people outside the art world don't realize that this is work that has been previously purchased and then is being resold. And in England, the artist does get a small percent, or is supposed to. I don't know if they actually get it. Is supposed to get a small percent of the proceeds, but in the United States, they don't. All of that money is made by, the person who's selling it.
This is great. Everybody's submitting questions now. I love it. I am curious. Brian Mooney asks, what is your favorite Banksy? Or if you prefer, where do you think he swings and misses? Now, I believe that's a sports ball term, but I think it means where it doesn't quite succeed. Do you have I'll let you answer either one.
Okay, I'll answer both. I think where he swings and misses is when he is too much. Well, there's a picture of the girl who was napalmed between two Disney characters. It's a very famous image of his, and it's one I hate because it's so grisly. You just can't bear to look at it. It doesn't bring up any feelings of, most of his work brings up a feeling of warmth and wanting to correct things. And that just makes you not want to look at it. When you're too extreme, you don't want to look at it. So that's my least favorite work. My favorite work outside of the big extravaganzas that people don't know he's done, like inviting 58 international artists to a theme park in Bristol, Disneyland, or his hotel in the West Bank. But the single piece that I like most is the one of the little girl patting down the soldier. That just says everything to me. It's just like, that's the world we need to live in. The little girl patting down the soldier.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question here. Let's see. This is an interesting one. Keith Emmerling is asking, what do you think Banksy's artistic development was like? It seems that there's a tremendous amount of understanding and background in the history and creation of the artwork. I think you really get to a lot of his influences from Greek mythology and such. Right. If you could imagine like some other stamps, visual stamps that you might see from other artists, obviously Disney is figuring large in there. And what was one maybe that surprised you during your research for this book?
Well, really, all of them did. And I wasn't expecting it. I mean, the Hannah Arendt reference was just really in the middle of this thing, completely out of left field. And what astonished me so much is that reference was there for all the critics to see. And no one picked up on it. Just like no one mentioned the Greek face on the Ronald McDonald. It just passed over. And his work is littered with these references. Like when I was researching Disneyland, they pretended that they were putting in this theme park, they were making a film. That's what they were pretending they were doing. And the name of the film was The Gray Fox. Well, it turned, I had to look up The Gray Fox, and it turned out that they were like a suicide force, or in World War II. I mean, he's got nothing is by accident. It's really, that's what I discovered. My second chapter is about a single piece in Folkestone, England, where he managed, just by placing it, to reignite a conflict between two real estate moguls that had consumed the newspapers for like 10 years in Folkestone, had finally died down. And then he puts this piece up in a certain place owned by one of them and rented by the other one. And the guy sends it off to be sold in Florida, and he doesn't own it. I mean, the whole thing just erupted. And it erupted into a lawsuit about, taking art out of its place and who it belongs to. And he had to know that was happening. He had to know something was going to happen when he placed it there. So there's that kind of premeditation. Everything is, I think everything is researched.
And can you remind us, Chandra Bassard is asking what period Banksy's work spans. When did his very first piece appear, and where was
Ooh.
that? If you could remind us. Now I'm quizzing you. I'm sorry, Carol.
Right, yeah, he came up in the Bristol art scene and music scene, which was a real, it was West Indies, it was electronic music, it was Massive Attack, it was all that stuff. So the first major piece is called Mild, Mild West. And it's a bunny shooting at a bunch of soldiers. I mean, like a Molotov cocktail, but it's flowers or something like that. I can't picture it exactly, but Mild, Mild West is one of his best works, and just has the idea that, oh, it's a teddy bear throwing and it has that innocence that I really like. You know, there's violence in it, but then it's sweet at the same time. How do you do that? I think that's really what's interesting about his work.
And when was that first came
Oh,
out?
that was in the
That first
90s.
big splash in
And
the
that's
90s.
that's on the side of a building in Bristol. You can still go see it. I've been there. Bristol is a place that really values its graffiti, and it's a wonderful place to tour. And that's one of the things you can see there.
I think that was one of the, when I first moved to New York, it was just after much of the graffiti had been cleaned up and
Right.
before we started paying graffiti artists money to tag things.
Right.
So it was this great time where the walls were really ugly and boring, and then started getting much more interesting. And I was glad I was there for his residency,
Yeah.
at that time. Is there anything else that you want to leave our audience with today? Anything that we must know, we must go look, we must go, besides buying her book? I'm going to say it again. You can pre-order through Antidote Books.
Well, yeah, I think to really look into, he's a philanthropist. This is what people don't realize. When he did Dismaland in the town of Weston-super-Mare, which is a declining seaside town, he brought 20 million pounds worth of business to them. And he built his hotel in the West Bank, which was devastated by the barrier wall, so that people would come there and see how the Palestinians lived and generate business in the area. So now people go to see the religious sites and they go to the hotel, which has a history of the wall in it, that he's done with a scholar, but of course it's a Banksy museum. But he keeps his focus not ideological. As far as he's concerned, his object is the wall. That's what he doesn't want there. And the people are not his focus. So I think looking into those things is sort of, I want it to be an inspiration. I think it could be an inspiration to a lot of artists to see how diverse they could work.
Thank you so much, Carol. As you can see, the link to buy your book is in the chat, and the chat is on. If anybody would like to send their best wishes to Carol, I'm excited I get to say it verbally. Thank you so much for this.
So
it's been wonderful. And thanks everybody for coming. There's lots more in the festival this weekend, and we hope to see you again soon. So have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Carol.